In the autumn of 1886, in the vast, windswept expanse of Pembina County, North Dakota, a peculiar construction project became the subject of local gossip and ridicule. It was a landscape of stark practicality, where every action was weighed against the coming winter, a season that did not suffer fools gladly. Along the Tongue River, homesteads were being fortified in the manner that had become tradition. Men spent their days with axe and saw, felling cottonwoods and oaks, splitting the logs and stacking the cordwood in tight, high ramparts against the northern walls of their cabins. This was the sensible, time-honored ritual of survival. It was a direct and understandable equation. More wood equaled more warmth. But one man, a Norwegian immigrant named Lars Hansen, was engaged in something entirely different. His woodpile was adequate, but not prodigious. Instead, his energy was consumed by a project his neighbors found baffling and profoundly wasteful. Around his small, well-built, but otherwise unremarkable cabin, Hansen was building a second outer shell. He had sunk cedar posts into the hard prairie soil, forming a perimeter a full 3 feet out from his existing log walls. He was now painstakingly sheathing this outer frame with rough sawn pine boards, creating a house around his house. It was a slow, methodical process, and to the pragmatic settlers of the Red River Valley, it looked like madness. Elias Thorne, a landowner whose farm was the largest and most prosperous in the township, often rode past Hansen's property. Thorne was a man of firm opinions, his success a testament to the conventional wisdom he championed. "He's building a fence for his own house," Thorne declared one afternoon at the general store, to the nodding agreement of others. "Wasting good lumber that could build a proper shed. Wasting time he should be spending at the woodpile." The sentiment rippled through the community. They called it Hansen's folly. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. Children would sometimes stop on the road and watch him, their curiosity mixed with the parroted dismissiveness of their parents. Lars, a quiet man with pale blue eyes and hands as gnarled as oak roots, simply continued his work, ignoring the whispers and the stares. Less than 2 years later, on January 12th, 1888, the sky would turn a terrifying slate gray. A storm, later immortalized in folklore as the schoolhouse blizzard, would descend upon the Great Plains with an almost supernatural speed and ferocity. It would drop the temperature by 100 degrees in a single day, unleashing winds of hurricane force and a blinding, suffocating curtain of snow. In cabins all across the territory, families would huddle around stoves that devoured wood, yet gave off precious little heat, their walls weeping with frost, the wind shrieking through every chink in the logs. But inside Lars Hansen's strange, double-walled home, a quiet, steady warmth would prevail, a small island of calm in a sea of frozen chaos. The folly would become a fortress. The foolish man would become a savior. What did he understand about the immutable laws of thermodynamics, of convection, conduction, and the profound power of dead air that everyone else, in their hard-won practical experience, dismissed as the nonsensical dream of an old-world eccentric? Lars Hansen's understanding was not born in a laboratory or a university lecture hall. It was a form of knowledge etched into his very being by the landscape of his birth. He came from Telemark, a region in southern Norway where mountains plunge into deep valleys and winter holds dominion for more than half the year. There, survival was not a matter of brute force, but of subtle cooperation with the elements. He had grown up in a house built in the traditional style, its foundation dug deep into a south-facing hillside, borrowing the earth's constant temperature to blunt the winter's spear. He remembered vividly how the first heavy snows were welcomed, not cursed. His father would go out with a wooden shovel and intentionally pile the snow high against the northern walls of their home. To a child's eye, it looked as if they were being buried alive. But his father had explained it in simple terms. The snow is a blanket from the wind. Under the snow, the air is still, and still air is warm air. This primal lesson formed the bedrock of his philosophy. When he immigrated to America, he carried this wisdom with him. He worked for a time in Chicago before making his way to the Dakota Territory, and his job there provided the second crucial piece of his education. He was employed at an ice house, one of the massive sawdust-insulated structures that supplied the city with frozen blocks harvested from the Great Lakes. Day after sweltering summer day, he would enter the cool, dim interior, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and earth, and marvel at the tons of ice that remained stubbornly frozen. The secret was the walls. They were not single, thick barriers, but two thinner walls with a wide cavity, 2 or 3 feet, packed tightly with sawdust. The foreman explained that the sawdust wasn't the real insulator. It was the millions of tiny pockets of air trapped within the sawdust that did the work. Air, when prevented from moving, was an astonishingly effective barrier to heat. It worked to keep the summer heat out of the ice house. So why, Lars reasoned, would it not work to keep the winter heat inside his cabin? The final confirmation of his theory came not from his past, but from the ancient knowledge of his new home. One autumn, while hunting, he had shared a small fire with a Métis trapper, a man of few words whose ancestors had understood the northern plains for centuries. Lars, practicing his English, tried to explain his idea for the double wall. The trapper listened patiently, then pointed with his chin toward a distant, snow-covered hillock. He spoke of the quinsy, a shelter made by hollowing out a large pile of snow. "You make a big pile," the trapper said, his voice raspy. "Let it settle. The snow hardens, traps the air. Then you dig in. The wind can scream, the world can freeze, but inside the snow, it is quiet. It is still. Your body's heat stays with you." Lars felt a profound sense of connection. The Norwegian farmer's son, the Chicago ice hauler, and the indigenous plainsman had all arrived at the same fundamental truth, a truth that the settlers, with their focus on bigger fires and thicker logs, had somehow missed. The physics behind Lars Hansen's seemingly bizarre structure were elegant and absolute. The settlers of Pembina County were fighting a constant battle against heat loss, primarily through conduction and convection. Conduction is the transfer of heat through direct contact. In their single-walled cabins, the heat from the stove warmed the interior air, which in turn warmed the logs of the inner wall. That heat energy would then travel directly through the solid mass of the logs to the frigid outer surface, where it was stripped away by the relentless wind. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a large hole in the bottom. Convection was the greater thief. As the air inside the cabin touched the cold interior walls, it cooled rapidly. Cold air is denser than warm air, so it would sink to the floor, creating a miserable, ankle-deep river of cold that crept across the room. This sinking cold air displaced the warmer air near the stove, pushing it upwards towards the ceiling, where it would then travel towards the walls, cool, and sink again. This constant, looping current, this convection cell, was a merciless engine of heat extraction, ensuring that no matter how much wood they burned, the corners of the room remained icy, and the floor was always cold. Lars's design was a direct assault on these two thieves. The 36-inch gap he was building, filled with a loose material, would be his primary weapon. The sawdust, dried moss, and straw were not the insulators themselves. They were the scaffolding for the true insulator, air. By packing the cavity, he was creating countless tiny air pockets, preventing the air from moving and forming convection currents. This large, stable cushion of dead air would dramatically reduce heat transfer. The inner wall of his cabin would no longer be in direct thermal contact with the brutal exterior. It would be touching a thick blanket of still, trapped air. Therefore, the inner wall would stay much warmer, and the chilling convection cycle within his living space would be broken before it could even begin. The outer wall would take the full fury of the wind and cold, but it would be thermally decoupled from his home. It was, in essence, a sacrificial barrier, allowing the inner sanctum to remain calm and warm. The construction process began in late summer, when the days were still long and the ground was workable. Lars started by laying a simple foundation of field stones, hauled from the riverbed on a stone boat pulled by his patient ox. This foundation traced a rectangle around his existing cabin, maintaining a near-perfect 36-inch distance from the log walls. This gap was the heart of his invention, and its dimension was not arbitrary. He had calculated that it needed to be wide enough to truly disrupt heat transfer and to provide ample space for his chosen insulation. Into this foundation, he set cedar posts, dug 4 feet deep to get below the frost line. He had chosen cedar for its natural resistance to rot, a critical consideration for any wood in contact with the damp earth. These vertical posts, spaced 6 feet apart, formed the skeleton of his outer wall. Next, he began the sheathing. He used rough-cut pine boards, purchased cheaply from the sawmill downriver. They were irregular and unfinished, a fact that Elias Thorne had noted with a sneer. "Not even fit for a pigsty," he'd remarked to his companions. But Lars didn't care about aesthetics. This wall was not for show. Its only purpose was to hold the insulation and stop the wind. He nailed the boards horizontally to the outside of the cedar posts, starting from the bottom and working his way up. He took his time, ensuring the boards overlapped slightly to shed water and block drafts, a technique reminiscent of clapboard siding. The rhythmic, steady beat of his hammer became a familiar sound in the valley that autumn, a counterpoint to the sharper crack of axes splitting firewood. Once the outer shell was framed and sheathed, he turned his attention to the most ridiculed part of his project: the fill. He drove his wagon to the sawmill and shoveled load after load of sawdust, a waste product the mill owner was happy to give away. He spent weeks combing the wooded areas along the river, gathering great quantities of sphagnum moss, which he laid out on canvas tarps to dry in the sun until it was light and spongy. From his own fields, after the harvest, he collected the driest, cleanest straw. In a large bin behind his cabin, he mixed these 3 ingredients. The sawdust provided density and filled the smallest gaps. The straw provided loft and created larger air pockets. The moss, he knew from his homeland, had the unique property of being able to absorb and release moisture without rotting, which would help keep the wall cavity dry. With his mixture ready, he began the slow process of filling the void. He would climb a ladder, haul up buckets of his light, fluffy insulation, and pour it into the gap between the inner and outer walls. He packed it down gently with a long pole, just enough to ensure it settled evenly, but not so much that he compressed all the air out of it. To his neighbors, it looked like he was burying his own home in refuse. "He's filling his walls with trash," one farmer said, shaking his head in disbelief. Come spring, it'll be a damp, rotten mess, full of mice and vermin. Lars also made crucial modifications to his roof and openings. He extended the rafters of his cabin's roof outward, carrying the roofline over the new wall. This not only protected the outer wall and its contents from rain and snow, but also created a covered walkway around his home, a sheltered space where he could store his firewood, keeping it dry and accessible. For his windows and his single door, he built deep box-like tunnels that bridged the 36-inch gap. These deep-set openings, which his neighbors found dark and cave-like, would function as miniature airlocks, preventing large gusts of wind and cold air from flooding the cabin every time the door was opened. He also lowered the ceiling inside his main living area, reducing the total volume of air he needed to heat. This was another point of contention with local wisdom. Elias Thorne, making a point to inspect the project one day, voiced the community's consensus. "Hansen," he began, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man accustomed to being right. "A man needs a high ceiling. It gives the smoke a place to rise. It feels proper. You're making a burrow for yourself." Thorne believed, as did most, that the key to winter survival was an abundance of fuel and a tolerance for hardship. "You spend all this time building walls and collecting trash," he continued, gesturing with his riding crop toward Lars's modest woodpile. "I spend my time cutting wood. When the north wind blows, we'll see whose house stands warm. A good hot fire in a well-built stove. That's the Dakota way, not this contraption." Lars paused his work, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty hand. He looked at Thorne, his expression unreadable. He did not argue or defend his theories. He offered only a simple, quiet rebuttal that further cemented his reputation as an oddball. "My fire will be small," he said, his Norwegian accent still thick. "It will not have to work so hard." He then turned back to his hammering, a clear dismissal that left Thorne bristling. Lars persisted day after day, driven by a conviction that was impervious to the mockery of his peers. He trusted the lessons of the snow-blanketed Norwegian farmhouse, the logic of the sawdust-packed ice house, and the ancient wisdom of the Métis trapper. He was not building a wall of wood and straw. He was building a wall of air, a silent, invisible barrier that he knew would hold the winter at bay. The morning of January 12th, 1888, dawned with a deceptive calm. The temperature was unusually mild for a Dakota winter, hovering just below freezing. Children set off for their one-room schoolhouses without their heaviest coats, and farmers, Elias Thorne among them, decided it was a good day to venture into town for supplies. But the old-timers and the few remaining indigenous people felt a strange unease. The air was heavy, the sky a peculiar shade of yellowish gray, and an unnatural stillness had settled over the prairie. Around noon, the change came. It was not a gradual cooling, but a sudden, violent assault. A low, dark wall of cloud appeared on the northwestern horizon and raced across the plains with terrifying speed. The temperature plummeted, dropping dozens of degrees in a matter of minutes. Then the wind hit, a solid wall of force that shrieked like a banshee, followed immediately by a blinding onslaught of snow. It was not the gentle flake of a winter postcard, but a fine, granular powder, like sand, that the wind drove horizontally, erasing the world and penetrating the smallest of cracks. Inside Elias Thorne's spacious, well-regarded cabin, the blizzard's arrival was an immediate and brutal shock. The wind hammered at the north wall, its roar a constant deafening presence. Thorn, who had made it home just moments before the whiteout, shoved logs into his large cast-iron stove, the very model of efficiency sold at the general store. The fire roared to life, consuming the seasoned oak with a voracious appetite. Yet, the heat seemed to vanish as soon as it left the stove. A bone-chilling draft snaked across the floorboards, so strong it made the candle flames on the mantelpiece dance and gutter. Thorn's wife, Mary, stuffed rags into the gaps around the window frames, but the fine flour-like snow was forced through the cracks anyway, forming little drifts on the sills. The high, vaulted ceiling that Thorn had spoken of with such pride now became a cavernous liability. The warmest air from the stove rose into the rafters, where it was useless, while a vast reservoir of cold air pressed down on the family huddled below. Within an hour, a delicate, beautiful, and terrifying layer of frost began to form on the interior of the log walls, sparkling in the lamplight. The heat was being sucked through the solid wood at an astonishing rate. Thorn kept feeding the stove, but it was a losing battle. He could feel the cold radiating from the walls, a palpable, malevolent presence. His woodpile, stacked neatly against the outside of the north wall as custom dictated, was now buried under a 10-foot drift, inaccessible. The small supply he kept in the woodbox by the hearth was shrinking at an alarming pace. A few miles down the river, the atmosphere inside Lars Hansen's cabin was from another world. The hurricane-force wind was not a roar, but a distant, muffled hum, like the sound of a faraway waterfall. The interior was preternaturally quiet. There were no drafts. Lars held a lit match near the edge of the deeply recessed window frame, and the flame stood perfectly still, a straight, unwavering spear of light. His wife, Anya, sat in her rocking chair, knitting, her feet resting comfortably on the bare wooden floor. Their 2 young children played with carved wooden animals on a rug in the center of the room. The air was fresh and clean. There was no hint of smoke from a struggling fire. On the wall, a small, precious thermometer, a tool his neighbors considered an unnecessary frippery, registered a stable 66 degrees Fahrenheit. The inner walls of the cabin were cool to the touch, but they were not cold, and they were completely free of frost. The small, efficient stove in the corner glowed with a gentle, ruddy heat. Its damper turned nearly closed. It consumed fuel with an almost miserly slowness. Lars had only added a single, medium-sized log in the past 3 hours. His main supply of firewood, stacked neatly in the 36-inch covered corridor between his walls, was perfectly dry and readily accessible. He had only to open his door into that sheltered space to retrieve more. Looking out the thick, tunnel-like window, he could see nothing but a churning, hypnotic vortex of white. The snow was piling up against his outer wall, and he smiled faintly. The storm was now providing him with yet another layer of insulation, a thick blanket of white to augment his wall of dead air. The house was performing exactly as he had designed it to. The outer wall was taking the brunt of the wind's fury and the biting cold. The thick cushion of sawdust, moss, and straw was preventing that cold from migrating inward. The inner wall, the wall of his actual home, remained an island of thermal stability. His family was safe, warm, and calm, living in the quiet eye of a frozen hurricane. As the blizzard raged on, Lars did not panic or pace. He was a man of data, of quiet observation. Periodically, he would rise from his chair, where he was calmly mending a piece of harness leather, and consult his thermometer. He would then open a small, leather-bound ledger on the table. With a stub of a pencil, He recorded the facts. January 12th, 4 p.m. Outside, blizzard, wind severe. Inside, 66 degrees. Fuel, 3 logs since noon. He performed his simple test with the match at the door and windows again, confirming the absolute stillness of the air within his home. His smoke test was flawless. The flame did not bend or flicker. There were no invisible currents of cold air bleeding into his sanctuary. This was not just a feeling of warmth. It was a measurable, verifiable fact. He was not merely surviving the storm. He was defeating it with physics. His home was a closed system, hoarding its precious BTUs with remarkable efficiency. While his neighbors were desperately burning through their winter fuel supply just to keep the frost from their bones, Lars was using his at a rate appropriate for a mild autumn day. His vindication was not a feeling of smugness or pride, but a deep, quiet satisfaction in the proof of his principles. The world could rage, but his careful calculations, his methodical labor, and the wisdom he had so carefully guarded were now paying their dividend in the most valuable currency on the prairie: safety and warmth. By the second day, the storm had not abated. It had, if anything, intensified. The world was a formless, shrieking void of white. At the Thorn cabin, the situation had grown desperate. They had burned through the entire wood box. Elias, his face grim and smudged with soot, had been forced to take his axe to a wooden bench, breaking it apart for fuel. The green, unseasoned wood sputtered and smoked, filling the room with an acrid haze that made the children cough and their eyes water. The temperature inside the main room had dropped below freezing. The frost on the walls was now a thick, white crust, and icicles hung from the door latch. Mary Thorne had moved the children into their parents' bed, piling every blanket and quilt they owned on top of them. Their youngest, a boy of 4, was shivering uncontrollably, his breathing shallow and ragged. Elias knew with a certainty that chilled him more than the air that they would not last another night. Their fuel was nearly gone, their heat was non-existent, and the cabin itself had become a frozen tomb. Humiliation was a bitter pill, but the fear for his family was stronger. He made a decision. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a thick wool scarf around his face, and took down the coil of rope he used for fetching water from the well in winter. He tied one end to the cabin's door handle, and with the other end in his mittened hand, plunged into the maelstrom. The force of the wind nearly knocked him off his feet. Visibility was less than 3 feet. He could not see the sky, the ground, or his own hand in front of his face. He navigated by memory and feel, following the faint depression of the path toward Lars Hansen's homestead. It was a journey of a few hundred yards that felt like miles, a terrifying ordeal in a world without dimension. Finally, his outstretched hand hit the rough boards of Hansen's outer wall. He fumbled his way along it until he found the recessed doorway and pounded on the thick plank door with what little strength he had left. When the door swung inward, the contrast was so profound it felt like a physical blow. A wave of calm, still, impossibly warm air washed over Elias Thorne's frozen face. The light from within was soft and steady. He saw no smoke, heard no roaring fire, only the quiet murmur of conversation. He stared, dumbfounded, into the small cabin. He saw Lars Hansen sitting at his table, his children on the floor, Anya in her chair. They were not huddled in blankets. They were in their normal indoor clothing. It was a scene of such impossible domestic tranquility that for a moment Thorne thought he must be hallucinating, that the cold had finally broken his mind. He stood there, a frost-covered specter of desperation, and could only stammer, "Lars, we are freezing. My boy is sick. We have no more wood." Lars Hansen's expression showed no triumph, no hint of, "I told you so." He simply nodded, a look of profound seriousness on his face. "Bring them," he said. "Quickly." He helped Thorn secure a new guide rope, and, together, they made the perilous journey back to the Thorn cabin. They bundled up Mary and the children, half carrying the lethargic little boy, and fought their way back to the sanctuary of the Hansen home. As Mary Thorn entered the warm cabin and felt the life-giving heat on her children's faces, she began to weep with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Later, as the children slept soundly under a single warm blanket near the gentle stove, Elias Thorn sat on a small stool, a steaming mug of coffee cradled in his trembling hands. He looked around the room, trying to comprehend the miracle, the quiet, the lack of drafts, the sheer, unbelievable warmth. He finally turned to Lars, his voice low and humbled. "How?" he asked. "My stove is twice the size of yours. I burned a chair, and still, we froze. How is this possible?" Lars rose and walked to the inner wall of his cabin. He placed his palm flat against the wood. "This wall," he began, his voice patient, like a teacher explaining a simple truth to a child, "does not feel the wind. It does not know it is a blizzard. The outer wall, it is the soldier. It fights the wind and the snow." He then gestured to the space beyond the wall. "Between this wall and the soldier wall, there is a space. It is full of sawdust and moss and straw, but mostly it is full of air that cannot move. Dead air. It is the best blanket in the world. The cold cannot cross it, so the heat stays here, with us." In that moment, Elias Thorn understood. All his bluster, all his certainty in the old ways, collapsed into a quiet, profound understanding. He had been fighting the winter with brute force. Lars Hansen had outsmarted it. When the great blizzard finally broke after 3 days of relentless fury, the landscape was transformed into a silent, white desert of immense drifts and sculpted snow. The stories of survival and tragedy began to circulate. The community learned of farmers frozen in their own fields, of children who never made it home from school, of families who survived only by burning their furniture and slaughtering their livestock inside their cabins for warmth. And amidst these harrowing tales, a new legend was born, the story of Lars Hansen's warm house. Elias Thorn, once the primary skeptic, became Hansen's most fervent disciple. He told everyone who would listen about the calm, steady warmth inside the double-walled cabin, describing it not as a miracle, but as a piece of profound engineering. The first delegation of neighbors arrived at Lars's homestead a week later. They were not there to mock, but to learn. Thorn stood with them, his presence a clear endorsement. "Lars," one farmer began, his hat in his hands, "Elias told us what you did. We need you to show us." Lars did not hoard his knowledge. He saw the genuine need in their eyes, the memory of the freezing cold still fresh in their minds. He took a crowbar and carefully pried loose a few of the boards from his outer wall, revealing the cross-section of his invention. He let them see the tightly packed, yet still fluffy mixture of sawdust, moss, and straw. He let them feel how the inner log wall, even on a cold day, was not icy to the touch. He explained the principles as simply as he could, using his hands to describe the currents of moving air in their own homes and the stillness of the air in his. He took a piece of charcoal, and on the smooth surface of a split log, he sketched the design, the foundation, the posts, the gap, the extended roof. He answered every question patiently, explaining the importance of keeping the fill dry and the logic of the deep-set windows. He was no longer the town eccentric. He had become its most vital professor of applied science. That summer, the sound of hammers echoed across Pembina County, but it was not the sound of new barns or sheds. It was the sound of adaptation, of survival. Led by Elias Thorne, a half-dozen families began the laborious process of retrofitting their own homes. They built their own versions of Hanson's Folly, which they now called buffer walls, or more commonly, Hanson walls. They dug new foundations, set posts, and sheathed the outer frames. Lacking Lars's specific mix of materials, they improvised. Some used flax straw, which was plentiful after the harvest. Others used chaff from threshing floors. One man, who lived near a rail line, even used shredded newspaper. The specific material was less important than the principle it served: trapping air. The construction was a communal effort, with neighbors helping neighbors, sharing labor and resources, all of them united by the memory of the Great Blizzard and the promise of a warmer future. The following winter provided the ultimate proof. While not as historically severe as the blizzard of '88, it was a typical, bitterly cold Dakota winter. The results were immediate and astounding. Elias Thorne, in a letter to his brother in Minnesota, wrote that he was burning less than half the cordwood he had used in previous years, yet his home had never been warmer. The drafts were gone. The frost no longer crept across the walls. His children played on the floor without complaint. The local school teacher, a thoughtful woman named Miss Albright, who had quietly observed and documented Lars's initial project in her journal, made her own set of observations. She noted that in the years following the adoption of the Hanson Wall, the persistent winter coughs and sicknesses that had plagued the community's children seemed to lessen. Infant mortality, which often spiked during the harsh winter months, saw a marked decline. The elderly, who were most vulnerable to the deep cold, reported feeling better and stronger. The innovation was not just a matter of comfort or fuel savings, it was a matter of public health. Lars Hanson's simple design had fundamentally improved the quality of life and the chances of survival in the harsh northern climate. The legacy of Lars Hanson's innovation did not remain confined to the small community along the Tongue River. News of the Dakota envelope, as it was sometimes called, began to spread. A traveling correspondent for the Dakota Farmer, a widely read agricultural journal, heard the story from Elias Thorne and wrote a feature article about the Norwegian immigrants' ingenious solution to winter. The article, complete with a simplified diagram based on Lars's charcoal sketch, was published in the autumn of 1890. It was read by homesteaders all across the northern plains, from Minnesota to Montana. The State Agricultural College in Fargo, North Dakota, took note, and in a bulletin on improving farm structures, included a section on the principles of double-wall construction and loose-fill insulation for barns and chicken coops, directly citing the successes seen in Pembina County. The idea, born of tradition and necessity, was now entering the official record, disseminated as sound agricultural and architectural practice. Lars Hanson had no formal education in physics or engineering. He had never heard the terms thermal bridging or R-value. Yet, with his simple materials and profound practical wisdom, he had mastered these very concepts. Modern building science would unequivocally validate every aspect of his design. The gap between his walls created a perfect thermal break, preventing the exterior cold from being conducted directly to the interior through solid framing members. the very definition of combating thermal bridging. The R value is a modern measure of a material's resistance to heat flow. The higher the R value, the better the insulation. A thick wall of trapped air, as created by his loose fill of straw and sawdust, possesses a remarkably high R value. Architects today design high-performance homes with double-stud walls, leaving a cavity that is filled with dense-packed cellulose or foam, striving for the very same effect Lars achieved with the waste products of his environment. His entire structure was a pioneering example of a high-performance building envelope, a system designed to create a stable, comfortable interior climate that is decoupled from the harsh exterior world. He built with scrap lumber, prairie straw, and the wisdom of experience what engineers today model with complex software and construct with advanced synthetic materials. The story of Hansen's folly is more than a historical curiosity. It is a parable. It speaks to the enduring conflict between conventional wisdom and genuine understanding, between brute force effort and elegant efficiency. In a community that believed the only answer to cold was a bigger fire, Lars Hansen demonstrated that the better answer was to not lose the heat you already had. His neighbors saw waste in his use of time and lumber. He saw an investment that would pay dividends for a lifetime. They saw him burying his house in trash. He saw himself blanketing it in the most effective insulator known to man. It was a quiet triumph of observation over assumption, of patience over haste, and of a deep inherited knowledge that valued cooperation with nature over a futile war against it. The prairie winds still howl across Pembina County, scouring the flatlands with their icy breath. They still press against the walls of the farmhouses that dot the landscape. But on some of the oldest of those structures, the wind no longer steals the warmth from within. It presses against a silent, unmoving cushion of air held in place by a double wall, a simple and profound legacy of the quiet Norwegian who built a house inside a house, and in doing so taught a generation how to truly come in from the cold.